Yeah, the original Runescape Classic artwork was actually hand-drawn and then scanned and then shrunk, which didn't actually work very well, which partly is something that didn't look very good.
Awesome. So, what kind of issues did you run into in the early days? I remember you telling me that it was all very carefully planned originally, and then you just got to a point where you just wanted to chuck stuff out there.
It got to the point where we'd been working on the game for about, well over a year, and we were getting pretty bored of writing it. And this was by far the longest I've spent writing any game. And I was beginning to think I'm never going to launch this game. So we started getting more and more just like, look, let's just finish the flipping game, so we can write the next one. So this is my diary that I made just coming up to the launch of Runescape Classic. I'm quite pleased I had to write down at the time what I was doing.
So you can see that they've actually worked on Christmas Day there as well, like on Boxing Day.
And it sort of accelerates as you get up to launch, and we just start going more and more bonkers as we just sort of like realising there's actually not enough game. Until you get up to sort of just in January, there's crazy things like, where is it? 2nd of January, new skill mining, 2nd of January, new skill smithing. 2 skills in one day.
Just to give you some idea, the next talk after this is about dungeoneering, which we worked on for 18 months.
What?
Bothered face? Anyway, we were working on dungeoneering for 18 months, and Andrew managed to produce mining and smithing in a day.
Yeah.
And obviously we went through about 6 months of testing. How much testing did you go through?
I had about a day of testing, and because we launched on the 4th of January. I think the testing on the 3rd of January with a few friends of mine, the only feedback I got was that it seemed a bit too easy to level smithing, and perhaps I shouldn't put the anvils and the furnaces in the same place. So you can thank one of my testing friends for the fact that they're not actually in the same location as each other, because I got changed on the 3rd of January.
Cool. So, Paul, actually, let's skip those questions there. No, we'll stick to that. What kind of issues were you running into in the early days? Because obviously you were responsible for the storyline. So.
Yes, I mean in the early days again I was just frantically trying to get as much content out as possible. It'd be nice to properly flesh out a lot of the storyline for the worlds, but mostly I was doing a lot of mapping of areas and making quests so that there was enough stuff for people to explore early on. Some of the bits of storylines which you've got in RuneScape today, which are now fundamental parts, were just sort of throwaway comments almost in quests. When I was writing the Restless Ghost quest, I wanted to have a little bit of chat with the priest in the church in Lumbridge, and I thought, well, he's a priest, we'll ask him about the religion of the world. So at that point I had to think of who the gods of the world would be, so then I thought, okay, we'll have 3 gods made the world, and I just sort of, not really any sort of plan to a lot about them. I just thought, yes, I quite like the concepts of different alignments, so I just sort of chucked that in, and now it's later on, nice little threads for me to expand out later on when I had a little bit more time. But it's interesting how this sort of works the opposite way as you would expect. Rather than thinking we're going to have this mythos of the gods and we need a church, we put a church in because it seemed like a nice medieval thing. And then we had to work out what went with it.
Cool. So, Andrew, around 2001 you launched the members version of the game. Tell us about that time.
So that was probably RuneScape's darkest day. Just before that, up until that point, I'd been writing RuneScape mainly as a hobby, with the plan that I would sort of fund it and pay my rent by internet banner advertising. But the problem was, in 2001, the .com bubble pretty much started to collapse, and the advertising dried up, and it got harder and harder and harder to find people who wanted to buy banner advertising. And it was a really vicious circle, because all the people advertising on the internet were other .coms, and as one went down, they stopped advertising, and it took another one down. You had a whole sort of chain reaction, and it got down to the point where I only had one advertiser left, who was paying pretty much breaking even on the server hosting costs. And then they pulled the plug, and I suddenly found myself in a situation where I had fairly hefty outgoings. I had no staff, but I was having to pay for my bandwidth and my rent and food, and no income at all. And I was like, nuts! I'm going to have to shut the game down. Can't afford the bandwidth. I'm going to have to go and get a real job or drag. But I thought it was one last ditch effort. I'd ask people if they'd give donations so I could keep the game open. But then and discussing it with Paul and a few other people, we thought that if we gave something in return, we'd be more likely to give donations, and we were worried that if we just did ordinary donations, everyone would donate once for the first month, and then we'd be closing it down a month later anyway. So we came up with this idea of members. We weren't at all sure if it would work, because at this point, pretty much everything on the internet was free. The idea of paying for something on the internet was like, what?
Wow.
We sort of did a back of the envelope calculation. We worked out we'd need something like 3,000 members to be able to break even, to basically pay for our server and pay our rent.
How many players do you think you had about that?
I don't know how many free players we had around then. What I do know is back then we had 4.5 servers. Well, there was one which we could only fit 500 players on, and they got full capacity every evening.
You couldn't log in.
You couldn't log in, but we couldn't afford any more servers.
We had massive problems with our early servers. They crashed if we put too many people on them.
So an early member's benefit was actually get to log in at any time.
Yes. You get your own server that isn't full. It turned out ages later the reason the servers crashed every time they were full was because the company that I purchased them off put the heat sinks on the CPUs back to front. I didn't find that out until about 3 years later. Spent absolutely months trying to work out why they were crashing.
We couldn't see them because they were over.
We couldn't see them. They were in the US. We couldn't open them up. Ages later, we opened them up to replace a hard disk, and someone said, "You know, there's melted plastic all over the motherboard." And it turned out not only did we put the heatsink on our back front, we'd not taken the plastic cover that comes off it. And quite amazing, we managed to get it on, but that was why Runescape was so unstable back then.
Crazy. So, and how long did it take you to get those 3,000 players that you needed?
So we were amazed. We were sort of like, it's never going to work. And then the first week we had 5,000 members, and we were like, oh, we're saved. We don't have to shut the game down. And then we suddenly realised, we've got 5,000 paying customers, we should perhaps answer their emails. We can't. So we spent that money, so we spent the money on the first members of staff.